This is Desaliny, and welcome to episode 3 of 90s Overlooked Underheard. Hey, so today I'd like to start talking about a brief movement during the very early 90s. I did mention in the first video about how genres seem to appear and disappear very quickly. And one such of these was the indie dance, or Baggy, or more specifically the Madchester movement, which peaked around about 1990 into 91. So this was basically just kind of indie kids, indie bands, guitar-based indie bands, responding to the club sounds of the day. So this was a generation of bands who would be going clubbing and would be listening to acid house and rave music as well, and were inspired enough by that to kind of try and introduce danceable elements into their sound, which kind of fit in with the club culture of the day. Being guitar based, of course, most of them still relied quite heavily on kind of classic popular music, classic rock, classic types of sounds. So a lot of these bands were quite heavy on things like 60s psychedelic sounds, or kind of Sly Stone style kind of funk, even a little bit of kind of krautrock kind of grooves. First of all the bands that were kind of doing indie dance music at the time weren't necessarily all indie dance. Remixes were big business at this time, so a lot of kind of more a lot of more traditional guitar groups at the time would commission remixes, house remixes, dance remixes of their records, which would lend themselves more to kind of club play. But I'm not really going to concern myself with that too much. In fact, I'm not really concerning myself too much with the mainstays of this kind of musical scene, which was heavily centred around the northwest of England, Manchester, hence Madchester. So the big groups would have been the Happy Mondays, the Stone Roses, the Charlatans, the Inspiral Carpets, James, bands like that. And there was a kind of a second tier of bands who weren't necessarily all from Manchester, but generally were from that part of the country, that region. So you would get bands like The Farm or the Paris Angels from Liverpool, the Bridewell Taxis from Leeds, and other kind of lesser Manchester bands like Northside or the Mock Turtles. But the band I'd like to talk about first of all are they were a Madchester associated band, but I really think it's very hard to classify them as kind of baggy in that kind of sense that a lot of the bands were. Anyway, the band I'm talking about are the new fast automatic Daffodils, and I'd like to talk about their album Pigeonhole. So yeah, Pigeonhole was released towards the end of 1990. So this was, I guess, the peak of this kind of music. 1990 going into 91. The new fads, as I'll call them, as they always tended to be shortened, because the name's a bit of a mouthful, they were just a lot kind of tighter and kind of wirier sounding, and just a lot less loose and kind of shuffly as a lot of the baggy bands that they were kind of lumped in with. And the lyrics were a lot odder, a lot more kind of fractured, with this surreal kind of Dadaist, almost nonsensical kind of approach to lyric writing. You just got the feeling that lines were put together and switched around because they managed to find a rhyme that they liked. And I think the main thing that separates the new fads from a lot of their contemporaries at that time were their influences, and certainly the influences that you can hear in their sound. And they seem to have a much more of a debt to kind of the kind of funkier post-punk groups, and also to the kind of there was a New York scene that was called mutant disco, which appeared around about the early 80s. So I think they shared some elements with that. I'm thinking of bands like ESG, Liquid, even the kind of more disco-y stuff like Dinosaur L. And from a UK kind of funky post-punk kind of sense, maybe bands like Pig Bag or 23 Skidoo. These kind of quite percussive, quite repetitive, funky bands that incorporate elements of kind of things like dub. There would be bits of melodica or sax, which, if you put it all together, almost perfectly describes the new fads. So, Pigeonhole. It's an oddly kind of timeless record in some sense. It certainly has some of the sonic imprints of the music of that time, but this kind of surreal, Dadaist, playful side to them kind of elevates them a little. The new fads, they weren't kind of trading in a lot of the clubbing, loved up cliches of the day. They were just very odd, very kind of beef-hearty almost in the lyrics. But it's kind of interesting. It kind of keeps you coming back to it. You want to decipher what's in there, but at the same time, it doesn't matter. It's just part of this percussive, propulsive journey that their music takes you on. So some key tracks. There are two tracks which use a very similar kind of template. And they are Big, which was quite a big indie single hit, and Fish's Eyes, which I think was also released as a single. And these are the ones that kind of adhere maybe closest to a kind of a looser sound that you might think of as indie dance or baggy, but they were just a bit kind of dubbier sounding. They kind of they were using some of these dub production techniques, this kind of circular, percussive kind of dancey groove with vocals kind of dropping in and out of the mix and instruments being pushed higher and lower all the time. Another track which highlights the kind of the less baggy side of what they were doing, the more overtly funky post-punk kind of sound, would be probably best represented by Working For Him, which is this much tighter, kind of stabbier funk kind of repetitive funky kind of groove. It's weird. It's still identifiably the indie sound of the day, but it kind of melds a bit of a Gang of Four guitar sound, but with a kind of a slightly lighter, poppier element of a band, maybe like The Wedding Present, while still sounding like the new fads. And another track I could probably highlight would be on side 2. There's a track called Amplifier, and this is where they get a little looser, a little more kind of psychedelic. There's kind of little bits of flute that creep in and out, and there's a flanged guitar sound, but it kind of marshals everything again into this kind of stream of consciousness, kind of tight, percussive, funky groove. I mean, this one reminds me a little a little of, I mentioned Pig Bag earlier, of Papa's Got a Brand New Pig Bag. It's got that kind of repetitive, kind of funky circling thing going on. The album's great. I still think it sounds great, and I think it is definitely one of the most overlooked of the records by bands of this genre, of this type, of that time. And yeah, give it a listen. It just feels like a really good, coherent, satisfying listen. So the second record I'd like to talk about today is by a band that really weren't Madchester at all, but they were certainly all Manchester. And the album I want to talk about is Shiftwork by The Fall, which was released in the early half of 1991. I could probably talk for an hour about The Fall, but that's not really what this is about today. This is about The Fall doing their thing at the time that Madchester was at its highest point. And The Fall had gone through multiple lineups. This was their umpteenth album. And I think they'd earned the right to be possibly critical of what they saw as a lot of these kind of upstart young bands that weren't really cutting it in The Fall's, certainly in Marky Smith's mind. I mean, the track on side one, Idiot Joy Showland, just to read a brief lyric, idiot groups with no shape or form, out of their heads on a quid of blow. I think it's safe to say Marky Smith didn't really see the longevity in this kind of baggy indie dance Madchester thing. And being the kind of curmudgeon, but a very astute curmudgeon that he was, Idiot Joy Showland kind of sets out his stall there. But having said that, the album does have some softer tracks which show a side to Marky Smith that we probably hadn't seen before. Edinburgh Man, also on side one, is very wistful, very kind of melancholic almost. Marky Smith had separated from his wife Brix, who was also in The Fall up until 1989 or thereabouts. And it seems like he was kind of quite reflective around about this time. Well, certainly more reflective than he tended to be. Certainly more open to showing a kind of softer side to himself. For a lot of people, a lot of people claim this is the best Fall track ever. It's a very, very good track. I don't think it's terribly representative of much of The Fall's output, which, if I'm going to take it aside to try and describe The Fall here, they just were repetitive and abrasive, and they incorporated a very strong rhythm section, always allied to a broad mix of sensibilities ranging from kind of early rockabilly through to Iggy and the Stooges, through to krautrock, through to Captain Beefheart, but always kind of filtered through the voice and the words of Marky Smith, who in my view is one of the great lyricists of all time. I rank him very highly. Anyway, back to Shiftwork. Despite the lyrics singling out a lot of Manchester bands, a lot of scene bands, as being basically worthless or out of their depth and not really up to it. The Fall do manage to mix in some kind of dancier elements to their sound. There are 2 tracks here, So What About It and You Haven't Found It Yet, which do kind of channel a little of the kind of indie dance sounds of the time. You Haven't Found It Yet particularly showcases an almost Happy Mondays kind of sound, which you could argue they were kind of grabbing back from the Happy Mondays themselves, who I think did have some kind of debt to the Fall within their sound, particularly in Shaun Ryder's lyrics and his vocal style. And on side 2, they hit a point where they start introducing kind of keyboards and almost kind of techno sounds, synthesized drum beats. Then they throw fiddle on the top. And that's the track The Mixer, which is a wonderful song. I think of their run of albums of the early 90s, maybe starting with Extricate, going through Shift Work to records like Code Selfish and The Infotainment Scam. I think Shift Work is the one that gets the least respect, and I think it's a fun record. I think it effortlessly kind of conjures up that specific moment in time, whilst still being Marquis Smith enough to call out its inadequacies. Anyway, there are suggestions below of things you may choose to do, as usual. And I hope you've enjoyed the video. Please tune back in again, and I'll continue with the next episode of 90s Overlooked Underheard. Thanks.